Once, there was a king of Egypt so beloved that even death could not end him. His brother murdered him, hacked his body into pieces, and scattered them across the land. But love is more stubborn than death. Welcome to Shadow Folklore. Today, the Nile moves through Egypt like a vein of living green through the desert's body. Along its banks, the reeds whisper in a wind that has not changed its voice in 5,000 years. At dawn, the eastern cliffs above the floodplain turn the color of beaten copper, and the ibis wade through shallow water where silt settles in patterns that look, if you squint, like hieroglyphs written by the river itself. In the cool hours before the sun becomes a hammer, the air smells of mud and lotus flowers, of bread baking in clay ovens, of incense drifting from temple courtyards, where priests in white linen have already begun the morning rites. This is the landscape of resurrection. Every year, the Nile floods and recedes, and every year, the black earth returns, fertile and wet, covering the sand. What was dead becomes green. What was barren yields grain. The Egyptians did not see this as metaphor. They saw it as proof, evidence written into the very ground beneath their feet, that death is not an ending but a threshold, and that what descends into darkness can rise again, transformed. In the temple at Abydos, in the dim inner sanctum where only the highest priests may enter, there is a statue carved from black basalt. It shows a man seated on a throne, his body wrapped in the tight bindings of a mummy, his hands emerging to hold the crook and flail, the shepherd's staff and the thresher's tool, symbols of kingship and harvest. His skin is painted green, the color of growing things. His crown is tall and white, flanked by ostrich feathers. His face is calm, neither sleeping nor waking, neither living nor dead, but something older than both. His name is carved in the stone at his feet, in the sacred script that the Greeks would later call ta hieroglyphica, the sacred engravings. Osiris, WSA in the ancient Egyptian tongue, Lord of the Duat, King of Eternity, the foremost of the Westerners, he who dwells in the place where the sun goes to die and be reborn. The people who worshipped Osiris called their land Kemet, the Black Land, named for the rich dark silt that the Nile deposited each year during the inundation season. They called the desert beyond the floodplain Deshret, the Red Land, the realm of chaos and death, where the god Set ruled over scorpions and storms. The Egyptians themselves did not form a single culture all at once. They were the product of millennia, the predynastic villages of the Nile Delta and Upper Egypt, the warrior, kings who unified the two lands around 3100 BCE, the pyramid, builders of the Old Kingdom, the imperial dynasties of the Middle and New Kingdoms. But across all these periods, across more than 3,000 years of continuous civilization, Osiris endured. The language they spoke and wrote evolved over those millennia. In the earliest inscriptions, carved into the walls of 5th and 6th dynasty pyramids at Saqqara, around 2400 BCE, the words are Old Egyptian. A stage of the language as distant from later Coptic as Latin is from Italian. These pyramid texts are among the oldest religious writings in the world, and they are saturated with Osiris. By the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BCE, the language had shifted to Middle Egyptian, the classical phase that scribes would study and imitate for the next 2,000 years. The coffins of the period were inscribed with spells, the so-called coffin texts, that promised the deceased would become one with Osiris, would speak with his voice, would rise with his rising. By the New Kingdom, around 1500 BCE, the tradition had evolved into what modern scholars call the Book of the Dead, though the Egyptians themselves called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day, a collection of spells, hymns, and instructions for navigating the afterlife. And at its heart was always Osiris, the god who had died and lived again, the proof that resurrection was possible. Egypt's geography shaped its cosmology. The Nile flowed from south to north, from the highlands of Nubia and the heart of Africa toward the Mediterranean. The sun rose in the east, crossed the sky, and set in the west, descending into the underworld, the Duat, where it journeyed through 12 hours of darkness before emerging renewed at dawn. The Egyptians saw patterns in this. They saw the Nile's cycle of flood and recession mirrored in the sun's daily death and rebirth. They saw both processes reflected in the human journey, life in the sunlit world, death as a descent into darkness, and the hope of resurrection into eternal life. Osiris was the god who unified these cycles. He was the grain that dies when buried in the earth and rises as new wheat. He was the Nile that retreats to the underworld and returns in the flood. He was the king who was murdered, dismembered, and made whole again to reign forever over the dead. The Egyptians built their civilization along a narrow ribbon of fertility hemmed in by desert on both sides. To the west lay Libya and the endless Sahara, the realm of the setting sun and the dead. To the east lay the Sinai, the Red Sea, and the route to Asia. In the north, the delta fanned out into a labyrinth of waterways and marshes, where papyrus grew taller than a man and the air was thick with mosquitoes and birds. In the south, beyond the cataracts at Aswan, lay Nubia, the land of gold and granite and harder peoples who traded and warred with Egypt in equal measure. The cities rose along the river, Memphis, the ancient capital where the god Ptah spoke the world into being. Thebes, the imperial seat where Amun ruled as king of gods. Abydos, the holy city of Osiris, where pilgrims came to reenact his death and resurrection. Heliopolis, city of the sun, where the Benben stone marked the first mound to rise from the primordial waters. In the Egyptian cosmos, the universe began in chaos. None, the infinite dark ocean of nothingness. From none arose the first solid ground, the primeval mound. And on that mound stood Atum, the self-created god, who brought forth the other deities by will or seed or speech, depending on which tradition you follow. Atum became Ra, the sun who sailed across the sky each day in his solar bark, and battled the serpent Apophis each night in the underworld. Ra's children and grandchildren populated the pantheon. Shu, god of air; Tefnut, goddess of moisture; Jeb, the earth; Nut, the sky, whose body arched over the world and swallowed the sun each evening, to birth it again at dawn. From Geb and Nut came the gods of the next generation, and these were the gods most intimately concerned with human fate: Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. Later traditions would add Horus, the falcon-headed sky god, either as the son of Osiris and Isis, or as an older deity absorbed into their myth. The relationships are complex and sometimes contradictory, because Egyptian religion was not a single unified theology, but a living tradition that changed and adapted over millennia, weaving together local cults, royal propaganda, and profound philosophical speculation. Osiris was not a creator god, though some late texts try to elevate him to that status. He was not originally a sun god, though he became associated with solar resurrection. He was, in the oldest layers of tradition, an agricultural deity, a god of fertility and vegetation, a divine king who ruled Egypt in a golden age before history began. But he was also, and most importantly, the first being to die, the first to cross the threshold from life into death and to return, not to the world of the living, but as the sovereign of a new kingdom, the realm of the justified dead. He is the patron of that most fundamental human transition, the movement from existence to non-existence, and the desperate hope that something endures beyond the grave. It was to acknowledge that the body decays, that the self fragments, that continuity is not guaranteed, but it was also to insist, against all evidence, against the silence of the grave, that love and memory and ritual can reassemble what death has scattered, that the soul can be judged and found worthy, that the underworld is not oblivion, but a kingdom, and that Osiris, who was murdered and dismembered and made whole, sits on its throne, waiting to welcome those who follow him into eternity. In the art and inscriptions of Egypt, Osiris appears with a consistency that spans dynasties. His body is almost always wrapped in the tight white linen of a mummy, the bandages leaving only his hands free to grasp the royal regalia. His skin is painted green, sometimes black in older depictions, referencing the fertile Nile silt, to symbolize regeneration and the life that springs from death. On his head, he wears the Atef crown, a tall white crown of Upper Egypt, flanked by ostrich feathers, sometimes adorned with a solar disk or the horns of a ram. In his hands he holds the heka and nekaka, the crook and flail, ancient symbols of kingship that represent the pharaoh's dual role as shepherd of his people and harvester of the land's abundance. His beard is long and curved, the ceremonial beard of divinity and royalty, fastened with a strap. His posture is rigid, immobile. He does not walk. He does not gesture. He sits or stands in the formal stillness of a statue, because Osiris is a god who has passed beyond action. He is complete, perfected, and waiting. He is the king who cannot die again, because he has already died twice and been resurrected into a state beyond change. The earliest mentions of Osiris appear in the pyramid texts, carved into the burial chambers of 5th and 6th dynasty pharaohs at Saqqara. These texts are spells and invocations meant to ensure the king's safe passage to the afterlife and his identification with Osiris. "O king," one spell declares, "you have not gone away dead, you have gone away alive." Another states, "The sky conceives you with Orion the dawn, light bears you with Orion. He who lives, lives by the command of the gods, and you live." The texts conflate the dead king with Osiris, with the constellation Orion, and with the undying stars, the imperishable ones who circle the North Pole and never set. Already in these oldest sources, Osiris is linked to resurrection, to the stars, and to the survival of the royal soul. By the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BCE, the Osiris cult had democratized what had once been the exclusive privilege of the pharaoh. The promise of eternal life through identification with Osiris was now extended to anyone who could afford the proper burial rites and funerary texts. The coffin texts, inscribed on the wooden sarcophagi of nobles and officials, contain hundreds of spells that allow the deceased to transform, to navigate the dangers of the underworld, and ultimately to become Osiris. "I am Osiris," the dead person declares. "I have come that I may revivify myself. I am the lord of those who are in the duat." In the New Kingdom, from around 1550 BCE onward, the tradition evolved into the collection we now call the Book of the Dead. Spell 125, the most famous, describes the weighing of the heart in the Hall of Two Truths. The deceased stands before Osiris, who sits enthroned with the 42 divine judges arrayed around him. The god Anubis, Jackal, headed guardian of the necropolis, places the dead person's heart on one side of a scale. On the other side rests a feather, the feather of Ma'at, goddess of truth and cosmic order. Thoth, the ibis, headed scribe of the gods, records the result. If the heart is lighter than the feather, if the deceased has lived a just life, spoken no lies, committed no violence or theft, then Osiris welcomes them into the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, a place of eternal harvest and abundance. If the heart is heavy with sin, it is devoured by Ammit, a composite monster with the head of a crocodile, the forepart of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. The soul is annihilated, erased from existence. This is the second death, the one from which there is no return. Osiris presides over this judgment in perfect silence. He does not speak. He does not need to. The scales speak. The heart speaks. The feather speaks. Osiris merely witnesses, the still center of the cosmic courtroom, the king who has himself been judged and found worthy, the proof that it is possible to die justly and live forever. The iconography of Osiris evolved over time, absorbing elements from other deities and regional traditions. In some depictions, he is shown as a fertility god, with an erect phallus visible beneath his wrappings, a symbol of regeneration and the potency of life over death. In others, he is purely funerary, a mummified king awaiting the souls of the dead. At Abydos, he was identified with the local god Kenti, Amentiu, for most of the Westerners, an ancient deity of the cemetery at Memphis. He became associated with the Apis bull, a living symbol of fertility and strength. At Osiris in the Delta, he absorbed the attributes of Angeti, an older god of kingship depicted with a crook and flail. The Greek historian Plutarch, writing in the 1st century CE, recorded a version of the Osiris myth in his work, Deicide et Oside. on Isis and Osiris. He claimed that Osiris was not merely a god but an ancient king who had civilized Egypt, taught humanity agriculture and law, and traveled the world spreading his teachings. Plutarch's account is late, filtered through Greek philosophical categories, but it preserves details that align with earlier Egyptian sources. He describes Osiris as a wise and just ruler, beloved by all except his brother Set, who coveted the throne. In the Egyptian sources, fragmentary, poetic, scattered across thousands of years, Osiris is described with a series of epithets that accumulate like layers of meaning: Lord of the perfect black, referencing the fertile soil; he who is permanently benign and youthful, Lord of the two lands; the good being, ruler of eternity, he who dwells in Orion. Each title reveals another facet of his nature. He is both the murdered king and the eternal sovereign, both the broken body and the reassembled whole, both the grain that is cut down and the harvest that feeds the world. His consort and sister, Isis, is almost never depicted apart from him. She is the goddess of magic, the throne incarnate. Her name, Aset, means seat or throne, and she is the one whose power makes his resurrection possible, where Osiris is passive, and still, Isis is active and relentless. She searches, she mourns, she transforms, she conceives, she protects. She is the magician who knows the secret names of the gods, the healer who can cure any wound, the mother who will stop at nothing to defend her child. Without her, Osiris would remain dead, his body scattered, his name forgotten. Set, the brother and murderer, is more complex than simple villain. He is the god of chaos, the desert, storms, and foreigners. He is necessary. He is the force that disrupts order, the violence that makes kingship fragile, the red land that surrounds and threatens the black. In some periods, Set was honored as a protector of Re, the god who stood at the prow of the solar bark and drove off the serpent Apophis each night. In other periods, especially after the New Kingdom, he was demonized, his statues defaced, his name erased. The Egyptians' relationship with Set was ambivalent. He was dangerous, destructive, and yet he could not be eliminated. Chaos is part of the cosmos. Death is part of life. Set is the shadow that makes Osiris's light visible. Nephthys, the sister of Isis and Set, is the quieter mourner. She is associated with death, night, and the liminal spaces between worlds. She assists Isis in the search for Osiris's body, and together they are depicted as twin kites, the birds whose mournful cries were thought to resemble women wailing for the dead. In temple reliefs, they stand at either end of Osiris's bier, their arms outstretched, their voices calling him back to life. And Horus, the son conceived after death, is the god who avenges his father and reclaims the throne. He is the living king, the falcon who flies between heaven and earth, the heir who proves that Osiris's line endures. The conflict between Horus and Set, the battle for the throne of Egypt, is one of the central myths of the Egyptian pantheon, and it is inseparable from the story of Osiris, because Horus's victory is Osiris's vindication. This is the family at the heart of Egyptian cosmology: a murdered king, a grieving wife, a vengeful son, a murderous brother, a mourning sister. It is a theology of mortality, a meditation on the fragility of order, and a promise that even when the body is destroyed, even when the world descends into chaos, something can be salvaged, something can be made whole. The Golden Age begins with a king who ruled when the world was young. Osiris sat on the throne of Egypt, and under his reign, there was no hunger, no war, no injustice. He taught the people how to plant wheat and barley, how to read the rhythms of the Nile, how to brew beer and bake bread. He gave them laws, not through violence but through persuasion, through music and eloquence. He traveled beyond Egypt, spreading civilization to Libya and Asia, leaving his sister, wife Isis, to govern in his absence. The land flourished, the Nile rose and fell in perfect measure. The people sang hymns of gratitude, and the gods looked upon Egypt with favor. But Osiris had a brother Set, god of the Red Land, god of storms and foreigners, and the wild places beyond the river's edge. watched his brothers reign with growing resentment. Set was strong, fierce, necessary. He was the god who protected Ra from Apophis, who embodied the raw power that kept chaos at bay. But he was not beloved, he was not gentle, and he wanted what Osiris had: the throne, the adoration, the crown of the two lands. Set planned his betrayal carefully. He measured Osiris in secret, perhaps during an embrace, perhaps while Osiris slept, perhaps by some cunning trick. He commissioned a coffin, a sarcophagus of surpassing beauty, carved from fine wood and inlaid with gold and lapis lazuli, sized precisely to fit Osiris's body. Then Set threw a banquet, a feast of such splendor that all the gods and nobles of Egypt attended. Wine flowed, musicians played, incense drifted through the hall, and at the height of the celebration, Set unveiled his gift, the magnificent coffin glittering in the torchlight. "Whoever fits inside this coffin," Set announced, "may keep it as a gift." One by one, the guests lay down inside the sarcophagus, but it fit none of them. Some were too tall, others too broad, others too slight. The game seemed harmless, a piece of festive entertainment. And then Osiris, good-natured and trusting, lay down inside. He fit perfectly. In that instant, Set's conspirators, 70, 2 men who had plotted with him, rushed forward and slammed the lid shut. They sealed it with nails and molten lead, so that no air could enter, no light, no sound. Osiris, trapped inside, beat against the walls of his prison, but the wood was thick and the seals were strong. He drowned in darkness. He suffocated in the silence. He died the first death, the death of breath and heartbeat, the death of the living king. Set's men carried the coffin to the Nile and threw it into the current. The river accepted its burden and carried it north, toward the delta, toward the sea, toward the places where Egypt ends and the world becomes uncertain. The coffin floated away, and with it went the golden age. Osiris was gone. The throne was empty. Set seized power, and his reign was a reign of violence and disorder, a mockery of all that Osiris had built. But Isis, wife and sister and goddess of magic, would not accept her husband's death. She cut her hair in mourning. She tore her robes. She wandered Egypt weeping, questioning every traveler, every fisherman, every bird that flew over the river. Where had the coffin gone? Who had seen it pass? She searched the delta, the marshlands, the northern coast. She journeyed beyond Egypt's borders, into Syria and Phoenicia, following rumors and dreams and the faint pull of her own grief. At last, in the city of Byblos, she found it. The coffin had washed ashore and come to rest against a tamarisk tree. The tree, nourished by the divine body within, had grown with miraculous speed, massive and fragrant, and had enclosed the coffin entirely within its trunk. The king of Byblos, marveling at the tree, had it cut down and made into a pillar to support the roof of his palace. And so Osiris rested, hidden inside a tree, inside a pillar, inside a foreign palace, while Isis searched. She came to Byblos disguised as an old woman. She gained entry to the palace as a servant, a nursemaid to the queen's infant son. Each night, she placed the child in the fire to burn away his mortality, to make him immortal. For she was a goddess, and she knew the secret of eternal life. But one night the queen entered the room and saw her child in the flames. She screamed, and the spell was broken. Isis revealed herself in her divine form, terrible and radiant, and demanded the pillar as her reward. I split the wood open and took the coffin out, and she wept over it with such anguish that one account says her cry killed the queen's infant son. She returned to Egypt with the coffin, to the hidden marshes of the delta, to a place of reeds and waterbirds where she could mourn in secret. But Set discovered it. He was hunting in the marshes by moonlight, hunting with dogs and torches, reveling in the blood and the chase. And he stumbled upon the coffin where Isis had hidden it. Rage consumed him. It was not enough that Osiris was dead. The body had to be destroyed. The memory had to be obliterated. The very possibility of resurrection had to be erased. Set tore open the coffin. He seized the body of Osiris, cold, stiff, waterlogged, and in a frenzy of hatred, he dismembered it. He hacked the corpse into 14 pieces, or 15, or 16, depending on which source you follow. The number varies, but the meaning does not. One piece to each nome, each province, each district, so that no one place could claim Osiris, so that no one could gather him whole. A leg in the marshes of the delta, an arm in the desert west of Memphis, the torso in Abydos, the head near Philae, and the phallus, swallowed by a fish, devoured, lost forever in the Nile's depths. This is the second death, the death of the body, the death of form and coherence. Osiris was not merely killed. He was unmade. His body was reduced to fragments. His identity dissolved across the landscape of Egypt. If the first death was the cessation of life, the second death was the annihilation of the self. But Isis would not stop. She called upon her sister Nephthys, who had married Set but who mourned Osiris nonetheless. Together, the two goddesses transformed into kites, into birds of prey with sharp eyes and mournful cries. And they flew over Egypt searching for the scattered pieces. They combed every marsh, every desert wadi, every temple precinct. They questioned the crocodiles in the river and the jackals in the necropolis. And slowly, piece by piece, they recovered the body, 13 pieces. 13 fragments of the god who had been whole. The 14th piece, the phallus, the organ of generation, the symbol of life's continuance, was lost. Some versions say it was eaten by the Oxyrhynchus fish, the Nile carp, which is why that fish was forbidden as food in certain regions and worshipped in others. Some say it was eaten by 3 fish, the Lepidotus, the Phagris, and the Oxyrhynchus, and that all 3 became sacred and taboo. The detail matters because it means that Osiris cannot be fully restored. He cannot return to the land of the living. A piece of him remains in the underworld, in the water, in the realm of chaos and dissolution. But Isis is the goddess of magic, and magic is the art of making do with what remains. She reassembled the body on a bier of gold. She fashioned a substitute phallus from clay or wax or wood. Again, the sources differ. She called upon Anubis, the jackal god, the inventor of embalming, to help her. Together, they washed the body with sacred water from the Nile. They anointed it with oils of myrrh and frankincense. They wrapped it in linen, limb by limb, until Osiris was whole again, mummified, preserved. Then Isis transformed. She became a kite once more, a great bird of prey, and she hovered over the body of her husband, beating her wings to create breath, fanning air into his lungs. She sang incantations, spells older than the pyramids, words of power that could call the dead back from the void. And Osiris stirred. He did not wake, he did not rise. He did not open his eyes and smile and return to his throne, but something in him quickened, some spark of life, some fragment of the man he had been. Isis descended upon him, took the form of a woman again, and in that liminal moment, with Osiris neither living nor dead, neither whole nor scattered, she conceived their son Horus, the avenger, the heir, the living king who would grow up in secret, hidden in the delta marshes, protected by his mother's magic, until he was strong enough to challenge Set and reclaim his father's throne. And Osiris, he descended. He could not remain in the world of the living. He had crossed the threshold, had died not once but twice, had been scattered and reassembled but never fully restored. So he descended into the Duat, the underworld, the shadowy kingdom beneath the western desert where the sun goes to die each night. There, he took his place on the throne of the dead. He became the Lord of Eternity, the Judge of Souls, the King who waits in silence for all who follow him into the darkness. The myth does not end with resurrection into life. It ends with resurrection into a different kind of existence, eternal, unchanging, beyond suffering and beyond joy. Osiris becomes the blueprint, the prototype, the promise. Every Egyptian who died hoped to become Osiris, to speak with his voice, to rise with his rising, to sit beside him in the hall of two truths, and be judged worthy of paradise. The myth is teaching a theology of fragments. It says that death scatters us, that violence and chaos and the mere passage of time break us apart. It says that love can gather the pieces, that ritual can reassemble what was lost, that even when we cannot be made fully whole, we can be made whole enough to endure, whole enough to cross the threshold, whole enough to be remembered. And it says that resurrection is not a return to the past. Osiris does not come back to rule Egypt. He does not reclaim his throne from Set. He does not walk in sunlight again. He becomes something else, a king of a different kingdom, a lord of a different realm. The myth promises not that we will live forever, but that we will not be obliterated, that something endures. That death is a transformation, not an ending. The story of Horus's revenge is told in another cycle of myths, inscribed on temple walls at Edfu, and recorded in late sources like the contendings of Horus and Set. A text from the 20th dynasty around 1100 BCE, Horus grows to manhood in the marshes, trained by his mother, and challenges Set for the throne of Egypt. The battle rages across the land, and in the divine court, Set tears out one of Horus's eyes. The moon, which waxes and wanes, because it is always being damaged and healed. Horus castrates Set, rendering him infertile, incapable of founding a dynasty. The gods convene to judge the dispute, and after decades of argument and combat and trickery, they rule in Horus's favor. Horus becomes king of the living. Set is exiled to the desert, to the margins, to the storms, and the chaos beyond the ordered world. And Osiris remains below, vindicated, his son triumphant, his legacy secure. But the heart of the myth is not the battle. It is the reassembly. It is Isis on her knees in the mud of the delta, washing the fragments of her husband's body. It is the goddess who refuses to accept annihilation, who insists that even scattered pieces can be made sacred, that even the dead can be transformed. The worship of Osiris was not confined to a single temple or a single priesthood. It was woven into the fabric of Egyptian religious life at every level, from the royal funerary complexes of the pharaohs to the modest burials of farmers and craftsmen. But certain sites became especially sacred to him, places where his myth was reenacted, where pilgrims came to touch the mystery of death and resurrection, where the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. Abydos, in Upper Egypt, was the holiest of these sites. The town itself is ancient, dating back to the predynastic period, but it became the center of Osiris worship during the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BCE. According to tradition, Abydos was the burial place of Osiris's head, or perhaps his entire reassembled body, depending on which account you follow. The site included a vast necropolis, the tombs of the First Dynasty kings, which later generations believed to be the tomb of Osiris himself. Pilgrims from across Egypt journeyed to Abydos to leave stelae, stone monuments inscribed with prayers, hoping that proximity to Osiris would ensure their own resurrection. The stelae that survive number in the thousands, a forest of stone carved with names and titles and pleas. May Osiris grant that I may enter and leave the necropolis, that my soul may not be turned away at the gates of the Duat. The centerpiece of Abydos was the Temple of Seti I, built in the 19th dynasty around 1280 BCE. It is one of the most beautiful structures to survive from ancient Egypt, its walls covered in delicate raised relief, depicting the king making offerings to the gods. A corridor leads to 7 sanctuaries, dedicated to 7 deities: Ptah, Ra, Horakti, Amun, Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Seti himself, deified. The Osiris chapel is the deepest, the most sacred, the innermost sanctum. Behind it lies a suite of 10 additional chambers, the so-called Osirian, an underground structure built of massive granite blocks, designed to resemble the primeval mound rising from the waters of Nun. It is a symbolic tomb, a place where the king could enact his own death and resurrection in imitation of Osiris. Each year at Abydos, the priesthood staged the mysteries of Osiris, a ritual drama that reenacted the god's death, dismemberment, search, and resurrection. The details of the ritual were secret, known only to initiates, but inscriptions from the Middle Kingdom describe some elements. A statue of Osiris was carried in procession from the temple to a symbolic tomb in the necropolis. Actors playing the roles of Set's followers attacked the procession, and actors playing Horus's followers defended it, engaging in a mock battle. The statue was placed in the tomb, mourned over, and then, after a period of lamentation, brought forth again, resurrected, and returned to the temple in triumph. The people of Abydos and the pilgrims who traveled there participated in these rites, weeping for the dead god and rejoicing in his return. And in doing so they enacted their own deaths and hoped for resurrections. Another major center of Osiris worship was Osiris, in the Nile Delta, where the god had absorbed the attributes of an older local deity named Angeti. The temple at Osiris housed a relic, a fragment of Osiris's body, or so the priests claimed, and it became a site of pilgrimage and offerings. The exact location of ancient Osiris is now uncertain, buried beneath layers of silt and the agricultural fields of the modern delta. But in antiquity it was famous, mentioned by Herodotus and other Greek travelers. Our third sacred site was Philae, an island in the Nile near the first cataract at Aswan, on the southern border of Egypt. Philae was associated with the myth of Osiris's death and the burial of one of his limbs. The temple of Isis at Philae, built during the Ptolemaic period around 280 BCE, became one of the last functioning pagan temples in Egypt, remaining active until the 6th century CE, long after Christianity had become the dominant religion. Pilgrims came to Philae to honor Isis and Osiris, to participate in the annual reenactment of Isis's search for her husband's body, and to pray for their own resurrection. The rituals associated with Osiris were not limited to these grand public festivals. They permeated daily religious life and, most importantly, funerary practice. Every Egyptian burial, from the humblest to the most elaborate, was in some sense an Osiris ritual. The body was mummified in imitation of Osiris's reassembly. It was wrapped in linen, just as Isis had wrapped her husband. Eternal organs were removed and placed in canopic jars. The body was placed in a coffin, and the coffin was inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead. Spells that identified the deceased with Osiris and invoked his protection. The opening of the mouth ceremony, performed on the mummy before burial, was another Osirian rite. Priests touched the mummy's mouth, eyes, ears, and nose with sacred instruments, adzes, chisels, blades, while reciting spells that restored the deceased's ability to see, hear, speak, and breathe in the afterlife. The ritual was based on the moment when Isis breathed life back into Osiris, when she made him whole enough to conceive Horus, whole enough to cross into the duat. By performing this ceremony, the priests ensured that the deceased, like Osiris, would not remain inert and silent in death, but would be able to navigate the underworld, to speak the spells, to defend themselves before the 42 judges, to declare their innocence and claim their place in the field of reeds. The funerary texts themselves are full of Osiris. Spell after spell in the Book of the Dead invokes his name, claims his identity, promises his protection. "I am Osiris," the deceased declares. "I have entered as a hawk. I have come forth as a Bennu, bird the morning star. I have made my preparations in Abydos. I am the possessor of a harpoon who took possession of the sacred eye. I am pure in the place of purification." The language is dense, elusive, layered with mythological references, but the core message is clear. The deceased is Osiris, and as Osiris rose, so shall they. In the Hall of Two Truths, where the weighing of the heart takes place, he sits on his throne, mummiform, crowned, holding the crook and flail, silent and watchful. The deceased must recite the negative confession, a list of 42 sins they have not committed. "I have not told lies. I have not caused pain. I have not caused tears. I have not polluted the water. I have not committed adultery. I have not copulated with a boy. I have not been aggressive. I have not stirred up strife." If the heart is pure, if the scales balance, if Ma'at is satisfied, then Osiris speaks, or more often, simply gestures, and the deceased is admitted into his kingdom, into the eternal fields where the grain grows tall and the harvest never ends. The priesthood of Osiris was a powerful institution. Priests served in the temples, maintaining the cult statue, performing daily rituals of washing, clothing, and feeding the god. They conducted the public festivals, the mysteries, the processions. They were scholars, keepers of sacred texts, specialists in ritual purity and funerary magic. To become a priest of Osiris required initiation, training, and often hereditary status. Priests shaved their entire bodies, wore white linen robes, abstained from certain foods, particularly fish, because of the myth of the phallus, devoured by the Nile carp. They fasted before performing rituals, purified themselves in sacred lakes, and spoke the ancient words in Middle Egyptian long after that language had ceased to be spoken in daily life. Offerings to Osiris included bread, beer, meat, vegetables, incense, and libations of water and wine. Model granaries and miniature boats were placed in tombs to provide the deceased with sustenance and transportation in the afterlife. Shabti figures, small mummiform statuettes, inscribed with spells, were buried with the dead to serve as magical laborers, to plow the fields and harvest the grain in the field of reeds so that the deceased, like Osiris, could rest in peace. One of the most evocative offerings was the Osiris bed, a wooden frame in the shape of the god's body, filled with Nile silt and planted with barley seeds. The bed was watered, and the seeds sprouted, growing green shoots that symbolized Osiris's resurrection and the promise of new life from death. These were placed in tombs, and archaeologists have found them millennia later. The grain long desiccated but still visible, still bearing witness to the ritual's meaning. The calendar of ancient Egypt included several festivals dedicated to Osiris. The most important was the Khoiak festival, celebrated during the month of Khoiak, roughly November to December in the modern calendar, during the season of inundation. The festival lasted for several weeks and involved elaborate rituals. The molding of an Osiris figure from Nile mud and grain, the watering and sprouting of the grain, the procession of the god's statue, the symbolic burial and resurrection. The festival culminated in the erection of the Djed pillar, a symbol associated with Osiris's backbone, or the tamarisk tree that had enclosed his coffin. The raising of the Djed pillar was a moment of collective rejoicing, a sign that Osiris had risen, that order had been restored, that the forces of chaos had been, if not defeated, at least held at bay for another year. These were not empty gestures, not mere theater. For the Egyptians, ritual was efficacious. It did not merely represent resurrection, it enacted it, made it real, brought the divine power into the human world. To reenact the myth was to participate in it, to align oneself with the gods, to ensure that the cosmic order, Ma'at, would endure, and to fail to perform the rituals, to neglect the offerings, to allow the temples to fall into ruin, was to invite chaos, to risk the return of none, the primordial void, the unmaking of creation itself. When the Greeks arrived in Egypt, first as traders and mercenaries, later as conquerors and rulers, under Alexander the Great and his Ptolemaic successors, they encountered Osiris and tried to make sense of him through their own categories. Herodotus, the 5th century BCE historian, who traveled to Egypt and recorded what he saw and heard, identified Osiris with Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, ecstasy, death, and rebirth. The Egyptians, Herodotus wrote in his histories, hold a festival in honor of Osiris at Sais, during which everyone lights many lamps in the open air around their houses. The lamps are small vessels filled with oil and salt, with a wick floating on top, and they burn all night long. This festival is called the Feast of Lamps, and even Egyptians who do not attend it observe the night of the sacrifice by lighting lamps, so that they burn not only at Sais, but throughout all Egypt. Herodotus was cautious, noting that certain Egyptian religious practices were too sacred to describe in detail, that the names of certain gods should not be spoken. But he also recognized that Osiris was central to Egyptian religion, that the myths of his death and resurrection shaped the entire culture. He was less careful about accuracy. His account confuses details, merges festivals, and imposes Greek interpretations. But his testimony is valuable because it shows how outsiders, even sympathetic ones, struggled to comprehend a religious system so different from their own. Plutarch, writing in the 1st century CE, provided the most complete Greek account of the Osiris myth in his essay on Isis and Osiris. Plutarch had access to Egyptian sources and informants, and his version of the story, Osiris as a civilizing king, Set's treachery, the coffin, the dismemberment, Isis's search, the conception of Horus, aligns closely with what we can reconstruct from Egyptian texts. But Plutarch also interpreted the myth allegorically, reading it as a philosophical parable about the struggle between order and chaos, reason and passion, the soul's ascent from the material world to the realm of pure form. For Plutarch, Osiris represented the rational principle, Set represented matter and disorder, and Isis represented the world, soul that mediates between them. This interpretation flattened the myth's specificity, turning it into a universal allegory. But it also ensured that the story of Osiris would be transmitted to later European readers, who had no direct access to Egyptian sources. During the Ptolemaic period, from 305 BCE to 30 BCE, the Greek rulers of Egypt attempted to synthesize Greek and Egyptian religion, creating hybrid deities that would be acceptable to both populations. The most successful of these was Serapis, a god who combined elements of Osiris with the Greek deities, Zeus, Hades, and Asclepius. Serapis was depicted as a bearded Greek god seated on a throne, wearing a modius grain measure on his head, with the three-headed dog Cerberus at his feet. He was worshipped as a god of the underworld, fertility, and healing, and his cult spread throughout the Hellenistic world and into the Roman Empire. But Serapis was not Osiris. He lacked the specificity, the narrative depth, the mythic resonance. He was a political creation, designed to unify a fractured kingdom. And while he was widely worshipped, he never replaced the indigenous Egyptian gods in the hearts of the native population. Osiris remained Osiris, the god of Abydos, the lord of the Duat, the mummified king who had died and risen and descended into the underworld. And Isis, even more than her husband, became a goddess of the entire Mediterranean world, worshipped from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Nile, her temples rivaling those of any god in the Roman pantheon. The Romans, when they conquered Egypt in 30 BCE, were fascinated by Egyptian religion. They saw it as ancient, mysterious, and powerful. Isis became especially popular, her cult spreading rapidly throughout the empire. Temples to Isis were built in Rome. The novelist Apuleius, in his 2nd century CE, work The Golden Ass, described the initiation into the mysteries of Isis in vivid, though cryptic terms. I approached the boundary of death, I trod the threshold of Proserpina, and I returned carried through all the elements. In the middle of the night I saw the sun shining with brilliant light. I came face to face with the gods below, and the gods above, and I worshipped them from close at hand. Osiris, by contrast, remained more obscure to the Romans. He was understood as Isis's consort, the lord of the dead. But he did not inspire the same devotion. His myth was too specifically Egyptian, too rooted in the Nile and the annual flood, too bound up with mummification and the judgment of the dead. He could not be easily transplanted to Rome or Gaul or Syria. He remained in Egypt, in the temples of Abydos and Philae, worshipped by the native population, even as the empire changed hands and the old gods were challenged by new religions. Christianity arrived in Egypt in the 1st century CE, and with it came a radically different understanding of death and resurrection. The early church fathers saw Osiris as a demonic deception, a false god whose worship led souls to damnation. Clement of Alexandria, writing around 200 CE, mocked the Osiris myth as absurd and obscene, calling the rites at Abydos shameful mysteries, and accusing the Egyptians of worshipping the body parts of a dismembered corpse. Tertullian, another early Christian writer, condemned the cult of Isis and Osiris as idolatry and sorcery. But there were also parallels that could not be ignored: a god who dies and rises, a divine son born to a virgin. For in later versions of the myth, Isis conceived Horus without sexual intercourse, using her magic to animate Osiris's body. A judgment of the dead where the heart is weighed, and the worthy are rewarded with eternal life. These elements echoed Christian doctrine closely enough that some scholars have argued for influence in one direction or the other, though the evidence is ambiguous and the issue remains contested. What is clear is that Christianity eventually supplanted the worship of Osiris. The temples were closed, the priesthoods disbanded, the rituals forbidden. The last temple to Isis at Philae was shut down by imperial decree around 535 CE, and the priests who had kept the ancient rites alive for more than 3,000 years dispersed or converted. The knowledge of how to read hieroglyphs was lost. The language fell silent. The gods retreated into stone, their names unspoken, their stories forgotten. For more than 1,000 years, Osiris existed only as a rumor in the writings of Greek and Roman authors, as a mysterious carved figure in the ruins of temples that European travelers occasionally visited. Medieval Christians saw the statues and inscriptions and interpreted them as evidence of devil worship or primitive ignorance. Renaissance scholars tried to decipher the hieroglyphs and failed, inventing elaborate allegorical systems that had nothing to do with the actual language or religion. The Egyptians themselves, now Muslim or Coptic Christian, had no memory of the old gods, no continuity with the ancient tradition. The rediscovery of Osiris began with Napoleon. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt, bringing with him not only an army but also a corps of scholars, scientists, and artists. The Commission des Sciences, ETS Arts. They surveyed the land, measured the pyramids, copied the inscriptions, and published their findings in the monumental description de l'Oeuvre Egypte, a multi-volume work that introduced Europe to the splendor of ancient Egypt. Among the discoveries was the Rosetta Stone, found in 1799 by a French soldier in the town of Rashid Rosetta, in the Nile Delta. The stone bore the same decree inscribed in 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphs. It was the key that would unlock the ancient language. Jean-François Champollion, a French linguist, deciphered the hieroglyphs in 1822, publishing his findings in a letter that revolutionized Egyptology. For the first time in nearly 1,400 years, the sacred script could be read. The names of the gods could be pronounced. The prayers, the spells, the myths carved on temple walls and coffin lids could be understood. Osiris returned to human knowledge, not as a vague figure from classical authors, but as a fully articulated deity with a complex mythology and a central place in one of the world's great civilizations. The 19th century saw an explosion of interest in ancient Egypt. European and American archaeologists excavated tombs, temples, and cities. The public was fascinated by the exoticism of Egyptian religion, by the mystery of the pyramids, by the romance of lost civilizations. But the scholarship of the period was uneven. Colored by colonialism, Egyptians were often portrayed as a degenerate people who had fallen from an earlier greatness. Their religion dismissed as primitive superstition, or at best, a precursor to Christianity. Serious scholarly work on Osiris began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Adolf Erman, Hermann Grappo, and other German Egyptologists compiled dictionaries and grammars of the ancient language, making it possible to read the texts with greater accuracy. James Henry Breasted translated the pyramid texts in 1910, revealing the antiquity and complexity of Egyptian funerary religion. E. A. Wallace Budge, keeper of Egyptian and Assyrian antiquities at the British Museum, translated the Book of the Dead and published extensively on Egyptian mythology, though his work was sometimes sensationalized and is now considered outdated in many respects. The most influential early interpreter of Osiris was Sir James George Fraser, whose massive work, The Golden Bough, first published in 1890 and expanded in subsequent editions, placed Osiris in a comparative framework. Fraser argued that Osiris was a vegetation god, a deity of the dying and rising crops, and that his myth was structurally similar to those of Adonis, Attis, Tammuz, and other Near Eastern gods who died and were resurrected annually. Fraser's approach was evolutionary and universalizing. He saw all myths as primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena, and he believed that religion would eventually be replaced by science. His interpretation of Osiris as a corn god became widely influential, shaping how the deity was understood for much of the 20th century. But Fraser's framework was also limiting. It reduced Osiris to a metaphor for agriculture, ignoring the complexity of his role as king, judge, and lord of the dead. It treated Egyptian religion as a stage in a universal evolution rather than a sophisticated theological system with its own internal logic. Later scholars, including Henry Frankfurt and Jan Assmann, have critiqued and moved beyond Fraser, emphasizing the specificity of Egyptian cosmology and the political and ethical dimensions of the Osiris myth. Excavations at Abydos, conducted by archaeologists, including Flinders Petrie, in the late 19th century, and more recently by teams from the University of Pennsylvania and New York University, have revealed the extent and complexity of the Osiris cult. The Osirian, the underground structure behind the Temple of Seti, was excavated and studied, revealing its symbolic representation of the primeval mound. Thousands of votive stelae and offering tables have been recovered, inscribed with prayers to Osiris. The site continues to yield new discoveries, including tombs, temples, and artifacts that deepen our understanding of how Osiris was worshipped over the millennia. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 by Howard Carter brought Egyptian religion to global attention. The tomb's treasures, including the famous gold mask, were displayed in museums around the world, and the curse of the pharaohs, a sensationalized media narrative, captured the public imagination. Among the objects in the tomb were numerous references to Osiris, amulets, funerary texts, and depictions of the king as Osiris, wrapped in mummy bandages, ready for resurrection. In the mid-20th century, scholars began to approach Egyptian religion with greater nuance. Henry Frankfort's Kingship and the Gods 1848 explored the political theology of ancient Egypt, showing how the Osiris myth legitimized the pharaoh's authority and provided a framework for understanding the relationship between the king, the gods, and the cosmos. Siegfried Morenz's Egyptian Religion 1860 emphasized the ethical dimensions of Osiris worship, particularly the concept of the judgment of the dead and the weighing of the heart. Jan Assmann, a German Egyptologist, has been one of the most important recent interpreters of Osiris in works like Death and Salvation in Ancient Egypt 2005 and The Mind of Egypt 2002. Assmann argues that the Osiris myth represents a theological revolution, the introduction of the idea that the afterlife is conditional, that immortality must be earned through just conduct, that the individual is morally accountable. For Assmann, Osiris is not just a vegetation god or a political symbol, but the embodiment of a profound ethical insight that death is not the end of judgment, that the self continues, that Ma'at truth, justice, cosmic order, governs not only the living world but the world beyond. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the rise of Kemetic orthodoxy and other neo-pagan movements has brought a revival of interest in ancient Egyptian religion as a living practice, not merely an object of academic study. Practitioners, mostly in North America and Europe, attempt to reconstruct the rituals, prayers, and festivals of ancient Egypt, including the worship of Osiris. These movements are diverse and often eclectic, drawing on Egyptological scholarship, personal gnosis, and elements from other spiritual traditions. Some Egyptologists view these efforts with skepticism, noting the inevitable gaps in knowledge and the difficulty of reviving a religion that has been dead for 1500 years. Others see them as a legitimate form of religious expression, a way of honoring and engaging with a profound spiritual tradition. In Egypt itself, the relationship to the ancient past is complex. Modern Egyptians are predominantly Muslim or Coptic Christian, and for many, the Pharaonic era is a source of national pride, but not religious continuity. The gods are history, not faith. Yet there is also a sense of ownership, a recognition that Osiris, Isis, and the other deities are part of Egypt's heritage, in a way that they are not for Europeans or Americans who study them. The tensions between scholarship, tourism, and national identity continue to shape how ancient Egyptian religion is presented and understood. Osiris entered the modern imagination not as a religious figure, but as a symbol, an archetype, a narrative fragment to be adapted and reimagined. The process began in the 19th century with the rise of Romanticism and its fascination with ruins, exoticism, and the sublime. Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem, Ozymandias, 1818, though it refers to Rameses II, not Osiris, captures the romantic sense of Egypt as a land of fallen grandeur, a civilization whose gods and kings have crumbled into sand. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. The broken statue cries, but the works are gone, the desert endless. In Victorian England, the Gothic novelist H. Rider Haggard wrote She, 1887, and Aisha, The Return of She, 1905. Adventure novels set in Africa and featuring immortal queens, ancient tombs, and echoes of Egyptian mythology. Though Haggard's work is more fantasy than faithful adaptation, it reflects the 19th century obsession with Egypt as a source of mystery and occult power. The early 20th century saw Osiris enter the realm of occultism. Aleister Crowley, the British occultist, incorporated Egyptian symbolism into his thelemic system. 1804, Every man and every woman is a star. Crowley's Gnostic Mass invokes Isis, and his writings often reference Osiris, though filtered through a dense symbolic system that owes more to Kabbalah and Western esotericism than to Egyptology. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a secret society active in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, used Egyptian deities as symbolic representations of spiritual principles, and Osiris appeared in their rituals as a figure of death and rebirth. By the mid-20th century, Osiris had entered mainstream popular culture. In 1932, Universal Pictures released The Mummy, a horror film starring Boris Karloff as Imhotep, a resurrected Egyptian priest who seeks to reunite with the reincarnation of his lost love. The film draws on Osiris imagery, the wrapped mummy, the promise of resurrection, the tragic love story. Though it distorts and sensationalizes the mythology, The Mummy became a staple of horror cinema, appearing in countless sequels and remakes, almost always as a monster or a curse, rather than a complex religious figure. In literature, Osiris appeared in more thoughtful forms. In Thomas Mann's Joseph and His Brothers, 1933, Fine 1843, a 4-volume retelling of the biblical story of Joseph, Mann weaves in Egyptian mythology extensively, depicting Joseph's time in Egypt and his encounters with the religion of the pharaohs. Mann treats Osiris with respect, using the myth to explore themes of death, renewal, and the tension between monotheism and polytheism. Norman Mailer's Ancient Evenings, 1983, is a more radical engagement with Egyptian religion, set in the 20th dynasty around 1100 BCE. The novel follows the soul of a deceased Egyptian noble through multiple reincarnations, exploring the complexities of the afterlife, the judgment of the dead, and the rituals of resurrection. Mailer spent years researching Egyptian religion, and the novel, though difficult and controversial, represents a serious attempt to inhabit the ancient mindset, to imagine what it would be like to live in a world where Osiris is real, where death is a journey, where the soul is weighed. In comic books, Osiris has appeared as both hero and villain. DC Comics introduced a version of the character in the 1940s, and Marvel Comics has used Egyptian deities in various storylines. These portrayals are typically superficial, using the names and iconography of Egyptian gods as window dressing for superhero narratives. But they have introduced Osiris to generations of readers who might otherwise never encounter him. The 1994 science fiction film Stargate, directed by Roland Emmerich, reimagined the Egyptian gods as aliens who visited Earth in ancient times and were worshipped as deities. The film and its long-running television sequels depict the god Ra, though conflated with Horus in some versions as a parasitic alien warlord, with other gods, including Osiris, appearing as antagonists. The premise is pure science fiction, with little connection to actual Egyptian mythology, but it reflects a persistent tendency in modern culture to treat ancient gods as either literal historical figures or as metaphors for extraterrestrial contact. More recently, Osiris has appeared in video games, including Assassin's Creed Origins 2017, set in Ptolemaic Egypt, which features the gods as powerful beings encountered in hallucinogenic visions, and Smite, a multiplayer online battle arena game where Osiris is a playable character, depicted as a fragmented god who reassembles himself in combat. These portrayals prioritize spectacle and gameplay over theological depth, but they also introduce players to the basic elements of the mythology: the dismemberment, the resurrection, the connection to the underworld. In visual art, Osiris has been depicted by countless artists, from the 19th century Orientalist painters, who portrayed Egypt as an exotic fantasy, to contemporary artists who engage with Egyptian imagery in more critical and self-aware ways. The British artist and filmmaker Derek Jarman included references to Osiris in his film The Last of England in 1987, using Egyptian iconography to explore themes of cultural collapse and rebirth. The American artist Kara Walker has referenced Egyptian funerary art in her installations, using silhouette and shadow to explore issues of race, history, and violence. What these adaptations reveal is a persistent fascination with Osiris as a symbol of death and transformation, but also a profound loss of context. In most modern portrayals, Osiris is reduced to a few elements: the mummy, the dismemberment, the resurrection. The ethical dimension, the judgment of the dead, the weighing of the heart, the promise that immortality must be earned, is often absent. The political dimension, Osiris as the template for kingship, the model of the just ruler who brings civilization and is destroyed by chaos, is rarely explored. And the religious dimension, the lived experience of ancient Egyptians who prayed to Osiris, who identified with him in death, who hoped to become him, is almost entirely missing. There have been efforts to reclaim and recontextualize Osiris from an Afrocentric perspective, particularly in the work of scholars and artists in the African diaspora. Osiris is claimed as an African god, part of a heritage that predates European colonization and the transatlantic slave trade. This reclamation can be powerful and necessary, a way of asserting continuity and pride in the face of historical erasure. But it can also be complicated because ancient Egypt was culturally and ethnically complex, connected to both Africa and the Mediterranean, and reducing it to a single racial identity risks simplifying a civilization that was diverse and dynamic. In a hospital room in the 21st century, someone is dying. The machines beep in steady rhythm. The family gathers. The person in the bed drifts in and out of consciousness. And the living wonder, what comes next? We no longer mummify our dead or inscribe coffins with spells. We do not weigh the heart against a feather or stand before 42 divine judges to declare our innocence. We do not believe, most of us, that the soul can be dismembered and reassembled, that love can gather the fragments and make them whole. But we still ask the same questions the Egyptians asked. We still wonder if death is an ending or a transformation. We still hope that something endures. Memory, legacy, the love of those who remain. We still tell stories about people who died and somehow did not disappear, who left something behind, who changed the world even in their absence. Osiris is the blueprint for that hope. He is the king who was murdered, scattered, and made whole again. He is the proof that even when violence tears us apart, even when chaos overwhelms order, even when the body fails and the breath stops, something can be salvaged, not a return to life as it was. Osiris does not come back. The myth teaches that death is not the opposite of life, but a stage in a longer process. The grain is cut down, buried in the earth, and rises as new wheat. The sun sets in the west and is reborn in the east. The Nile recedes into the desert and returns in the flood. Osiris dies twice and descends into the underworld, and from his throne in the Duat he judges the dead, welcomes the worthy, and rejects the wicked. He is neither living nor dead but both, and neither, a god of the threshold, a god of the in-between. We live in an age that fears fragmentation. We see it in our politics, our communities, ourselves. We see institutions that once seemed solid breaking apart. We see narratives that once unified us, splintering into incompatible fragments. We see the self, that sense of continuity and coherence, fractured by trauma, by loss, by the sheer velocity of change. We wonder if we can be made whole again, if the pieces can be gathered, if love and memory and ritual are enough to hold us together. Osiris says, maybe with something missing, something lost to the river, something that cannot be recovered, but whole enough to endure, whole enough to cross the threshold, whole enough to be remembered. The myth also teaches that judgment is real, but we know, in some way, that our actions have weight, that cruelty and kindness are not the same, that the way we treat each other matters in a moral universe, even if we do not know who is keeping score. Osiris is the god who waits at the end. He is patient. He is silent. He does not argue or plead. He simply watches the scales, and when the heart is light, when the balance holds, he welcomes the dead into his kingdom, into the field of reeds, where the grain grows tall and the harvest is eternal. The river still flows through Egypt. The sun still rises over the eastern cliffs and sets in the west. The temples are ruins now, their priests long gone, their rituals forgotten. Not as a god to be worshipped, most of us do not believe in him that way, but as a story that speaks to something fundamental in the human experience, the confrontation with mortality, the hope for continuity, the refusal to accept that death is the final word. Every person who has ever tried to make sense of loss understands the reassembly of fragments. Every person who has ever hoped that their life mattered, that their actions counted for something, that they will be remembered and judged fairly, understands the weighing of the heart. Osiris does not promise that we will live forever. He promises that we will not be forgotten, that the pieces can be gathered. That love is stronger than death. That even in the underworld, there is a kingdom, a throne, a harvest, that we can become whole enough to cross the threshold, to stand before the judges, to speak our names, and to be recognized. The Nile flows, the grain grows, the sun sets and rises. The story continues, 3,000 years after the last priest performed the last ritual in the last temple. Because the story is not about Egypt, it is about us, about what we fear and what we hope, about the fragility of the body and the persistence of memory, about the king who was murdered and reassembled and resurrected into a kingdom we cannot see but can imagine. If we close our eyes, if we listen to the wind in the reeds, if we remember that love is more stubborn than death. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more folklore myths and mysterious creatures.